3:47 a.m. in Tel Aviv. The streets are empty, suspended in that quiet hour where even the city seems to exhale. The Mediterranean breeze moves through the buildings the same way it has for centuries, indifferent to politics, to conflict, to human urgency. And then in a single synchronized moment, every phone in Israel lights up. Emergency broadcast, threat level 5, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. There is a reason this message feels different, heavier, almost unreal. Israel has never, in its entire modern history, issued a level 5 national alert. Not during the Yom Kippur War, not during the Gulf War when Scud missiles fell from the sky, not during the repeated cycles of escalation in Gaza, not even during the shock of October 7th. Level 5 is not a warning, it is a conclusion. It means the government has already assessed that mass casualty strikes are not just possible, they are likely, and they are incoming. So the question forms immediately, what could push Israel to that threshold? What kind of intelligence forces a state that has lived under constant threat for decades to say, this is different, this is something else entirely? The answer did not arrive in a single moment. It emerged over 72 hours, scattered across cargo manifests, satellite imagery, and signals intelligence so alarming that senior officials were pulled from their beds in the middle of the night to review it in real time. What they saw was not a small transfer, not a symbolic gesture, but something on an entirely different scale. North Korea had just completed the largest ballistic missile transfer in modern history. 2,000 Hwasong-class missiles delivered into Iranian hands. Not theoretical, not under development, operational, armed, positioned, and already being integrated into a deployment framework. At the same time, in Washington, the lights in the Situation Room have not gone off for days. Continuous briefings, continuous reassessment, because what this represents is not just another regional development, it is a structural shift, a moment where the assumptions that have governed the balance of power in the Middle East begin to fracture under pressure. To understand why, you have to look closely at the system itself. The missile in question is not a relic of older technology. It represents a significant advancement. Terminal speeds reaching Mach 12 to Mach 15 compress the engagement window for any defensive system to an almost unforgiving margin. Interception becomes not just difficult, but time constrained in a way that leaves almost no room for error. Israel's missile defense architecture is among the most advanced in the world, layered, integrated, refined over years of constant conflict. Iron Dome handles short-range threats. David's Sling covers medium to long-range engagements. Arrow systems are designed for high-altitude ballistic interception. But every system, no matter how advanced, operates within limits. There are only so many interceptors loaded at any given time, only so many radar tracks that can be processed simultaneously, only so many firing solutions that can be executed within seconds. These are not theoretical constraints, they are physical realities. And modern missile doctrine understands this very clearly. The concept is called saturation. It is brutally simple. If the number of incoming threats exceeds the number of available interceptors, some will get through. It is not a failure of technology, it is arithmetic. Now consider what 2,000 advanced ballistic missiles represent in that equation. Even under optimistic assumptions, even with rapid resupply from allies, the numbers do not align in a way that produces confidence. They produce something else entirely. They produce the expectation that a significant number of warheads will reach their targets. And these are not minor threats. Each warhead carries a payload capable of striking hardened infrastructure, air bases, power stations, command centers, ports, urban population centers. Even without nuclear capability, the destructive potential is substantial. Delivered at high velocity with maneuvering re-entry technology that allows the warhead to adjust its path during descent, the challenge to intercept becomes even more severe. Traditional interception relies on predicting where the missile will land. But if the target itself is moving in its final seconds, that prediction becomes unstable. The interceptor is no longer meeting a fixed point. It is chasing uncertainty. Geography adds another layer to this. From western Iran, the entire territory of Israel falls well within operational range. Every major city, every critical facility, every node that supports the functioning of the state exists inside that envelope. This is what transforms the situation from a military concern into something closer to an existential calculation. It is not about isolated strikes. It is about systemic vulnerability. This is why the alert was issued, not as a precaution, but as a reflection of the underlying math. And yet, another question emerges, equally important. How does a transfer of this magnitude happen without immediate detection? How do 2,000 advanced missiles move across the world without triggering a decisive response before completion? The answer lies in a combination of preparation, experience, and timing. North Korea has spent decades refining methods to evade sanctions and monitoring systems. Layered shipping structures, falsified documentation, shell corporations operating in jurisdictions with minimal oversight, movements broken into smaller segments to avoid detection patterns. Overland transport conducted under civilian cover, timed to exploit gaps in surveillance. Iran's intelligence services, experienced in counter-surveillance, understand exactly what signals to suppress and when. And at the same time, the global intelligence community is not operating in a vacuum. Attention is divided. Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea. Domestic pressures within major powers. Intelligence bandwidth, like any resource, is finite. When it is stretched, gaps appear. And in this case, something massive moved through those gaps. The immediate response from the United States reflects the seriousness of the situation. Naval forces repositioned. Carrier strike groups moved into operational range. Strategic bombers placed on heightened alert. Air defense systems redeployed to protect critical infrastructure across the region. Diplomacy activated at the highest levels. Emergency sessions convened, but even within this response, there is division. Because the core question is not just what has happened, but what should be done next. One line of thinking argues that there's a narrow window for preemptive action. While the missiles are still concentrated in identifiable locations, they represent a targetable problem. Once dispersed across hardened sites, underground facilities, and urban environments, that problem becomes significantly more complex, potentially unsolvable through conventional air campaigns. But the counter-argument carries equal weight. A strike of the scale required to neutralize such an arsenal would constitute a direct act of war. The escalation risks are not abstract. They are immediate and far-reaching. Iran has the capacity to respond across multiple domains. It can target shipping lanes, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical artery for global oil supply. It can activate proxy forces across multiple countries, opening simultaneous fronts. Any surviving missile assets would almost certainly be launched in retaliation. The margin for error in such a scenario is effectively zero. The decision, if it exists, must be made quickly, but the consequences of that decision extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. Understanding intent becomes crucial and also incredibly difficult. One interpretation suggests that this buildup is primarily about deterrence, a message designed to raise the cost of any potential attack to an unacceptable level. History has shown that states without strong deterrent capabilities are more vulnerable to external intervention. From this perspective, the missiles are not meant to be used, but to prevent use against Iran itself. But another interpretation points to observable indicators that suggest something more active. Movement of missiles from storage to launch positions, fueling activity, communication patterns that align more closely with operational timelines than with static deterrence. The reality may not sit cleanly in either category. It may be a combination. A deterrent posture that is being demonstrated in a way that requires readiness for actual use. And this is where the danger intensifies. Because deterrence only works if signals are correctly interpreted. In a high tension environment with forces mobilized and timelines compressed, the probability of misinterpretation increases. And misinterpretation in this context is not a minor error, it is a trigger. Israel's strategic culture has been shaped by a consistent principle since its founding. The state does not accept prolonged existential vulnerability. When a threat reaches a certain threshold, action becomes not just an option, but an expectation. The events of October 7th intensified this mindset, not by weakening resolve, but by removing any remaining assumption that threats can be managed without decisive response. A level 5 alert does not create hesitation, it creates urgency. Internally, pressure builds. Political leadership faces demands not to wait, not to rely solely on external diplomacy, but to act before the situation becomes irreversible. Military leadership presents options, each carrying significant risk. There is no clean path, no scenario that guarantees safety without cost. But the alternative, allowing such a capability to remain in place and operational, carries its own set of risks that may be perceived as even greater. And when you step back, when you widen the frame beyond the immediate crisis, a larger pattern begins to emerge. This transfer is not an isolated event. It fits into a broader alignment that has been developing over time. Cooperation between Russia, Iran, and North Korea has increased across multiple domains: military support, technology exchange, strategic coordination, not formalized into a single alliance, but functioning in a way that produces similar effects. For global powers, particularly the United States and its allies, this creates a complex challenge. Resources are not unlimited. Commitments in one region affect capabilities in another. A major conflict in the Middle East, occurring alongside ongoing tensions elsewhere, would stretch systems that are already under pressure. For other global actors, this moment becomes an opportunity to observe, to analyze responses, to draw lessons that may influence future decisions in entirely different regions. Economic systems begin to react even before any direct conflict occurs. Energy markets respond to perceived risk, supply chains adjust, costs shift. The mere presence of a credible threat is enough to trigger movement. And if that threat escalates into action, the effects propagate quickly through transportation costs, through manufacturing, through everyday living expenses. The impact is not confined to one region. It becomes global. At a deeper level, something else is happening. A precedent is being set. The assumption that advanced military technology can be contained through existing systems is being tested and, in this case, challenged. When a large-scale transfer occurs without effective interruption, it sends a signal, not just to allies and adversaries directly involved, but to every state observing from a distance. It suggests that the barriers to acquiring such capabilities may not be as strong as previously believed. And when that belief begins to shift, behavior follows. Nations reassess their own positions, their vulnerabilities, their strategic needs. The logic of deterrence spreads, and with it, the complexity of maintaining stability increases because each new actor operating under that logic adds another layer to an already intricate system. So the situation that began with a single alert in the early hours of the morning expands outward. It becomes a network of decisions, pressures, calculations, each interacting with the others. Military readiness, political will, economic response, strategic signaling, all moving simultaneously, all influencing the path forward. And yet, despite all of this movement, no decisive action has been publicly taken. Not yet. Forces are positioned, systems are active, communications continue. But the final step, the one that would shift the situation from tension to direct conflict, remains unmade. For now, that does not mean stability. It means the system is in a state of suspended decision. And in that suspension, the weight of possibility grows because the range of outcomes is still open. Narrowing, perhaps, but not closed. And the individuals responsible for making those decisions are operating under conditions that are far from ideal. Limited time, incomplete information. High stakes that extend beyond any single nation. History shows that moments like this do not always resolve in predictable ways. Sometimes events accelerate. Sometimes they pause. Sometimes they move in directions that were not anticipated by any of the actors involved. What matters is not just the capabilities in play, but how those capabilities are interpreted and acted upon. Understanding that dynamic is the key, not to predict with certainty, but to recognize the structure of the situation, to see how a single development can cascade across systems, to understand why an alert at 3:47 inches in the morning can carry implications that reach far beyond the immediate moment. Because once you see that structure clearly, the situation is no longer distant. It becomes immediate, connected, and consequential in ways that are difficult to ignore. What happens next is not announced. It does not arrive with a clear signal or a formal declaration. It emerges through movement, through decisions that are made quietly and then executed with speed. In rooms where the lights have not dimmed for days, the conversation has shifted from assessment to commitment. There is a point in every crisis where analysis gives way to action, where the cost of waiting begins to outweigh the risks of moving. That point is not fixed, it is perceived. And perception under pressure can shift quickly. In Tel Aviv, the sense of urgency has hardened into something more concrete. The question is no longer whether the threat is real. That has been answered. The question is whether the window to act before that threat becomes irreversible still exists. Military planners work with timelines that are measured not in weeks, but in hours. Every satellite pass, every intercepted communication, every movement on the ground is fed into models that attempt to define that window. And the models are not comforting. They suggest that dispersal is accelerating, that fixed targets are becoming mobile, that opportunities, once clear, are becoming ambiguous. In Washington, the calculation runs in parallel, but with additional layers. Alliances, global commitments, economic implications. The United States is not simply responding to a regional threat. It is managing a system of interconnected obligations. The presence of carrier groups, strategic bombers, and advanced air defense systems is not just about readiness. It is about signaling, about shaping the decision-making environment of every actor involved. But signaling has limits. It can deter, it can influence, but it cannot guarantee outcomes. And in Tehran, the posture remains outwardly controlled. There is no dramatic escalation in rhetoric, no overt declaration that would confirm intent, but beneath that surface, activity continues. Movement continues. Preparation continues. This is not a static situation. It is dynamic, evolving, adjusting in response to every perceived shift from the other side. And that is what makes it unstable. because each side is not only acting, it is reacting to what it believes the other side is about to do. This is the essence of escalation dynamics. Not a single step, but a sequence of moves and countermoves, each one narrowing the available space for de-escalation. At first, the options are broad: delay, negotiate, signal restraint. But as forces mobilize and readiness levels increase, those options begin to compress. Actions that were once reversible become locked in. Decisions that could be delayed become urgent. And eventually, the system reaches a point where inaction itself becomes a form of action, one that carries its own risks. The Israeli leadership understands this progression. It is embedded in decades of strategic thinking shaped by a security environment where waiting has often carried a high cost. The argument being made internally is not abstract. It is grounded in a simple premise. A threat of this scale, once fully operational and dispersed, may not be neutralizable. And if it cannot be neutralized, it must be lived with. That is a reality that Israeli doctrine has historically resisted accepting. But the alternative is not simple. A preemptive strike on the scale required would not be a limited operation. It would be a campaign. Multiple waves, multiple targets, deep penetration into defended territory. It would require coordination with allies, real-time intelligence, and a level of precision that leaves very little room for error. And even if executed successfully, it would not eliminate risk, it would transform it. Because the response would come not as a single action, but as a networked reaction. Missile launches from surviving assets, rocket fire from non-state actors positioned across multiple borders, attacks on maritime routes, cyber operations targeting infrastructure. The conflict would not remain contained. It would expand geographically and operationally. And once that expansion begins, controlling it becomes significantly more difficult. There is also the question of timing. Acting too early risks targeting incomplete information, missing hidden assets, and triggering a response without achieving the intended objective. Acting too late risks allowing the threat to reach a level where action becomes ineffective. The space between those 2 points is narrow, and it is shrinking. Globally, the effects of this uncertainty continue to spread. Markets adjust not just to events, but to probabilities. Energy prices fluctuate with each new piece of intelligence, each shift in posture. Governments begin contingency planning. Strategic reserves are evaluated. Supply chains are reassessed. These are not reactions to conflict. They are reactions to the possibility of conflict. And that possibility is now being treated as credible. In Europe, attention is divided. The ongoing commitments in Ukraine remain a priority. But the potential for a parallel crisis in the Middle East introduces new strain. Resources that were allocated with one scenario in mind must now be reconsidered under another. Defense planning becomes more complex. Coordination becomes more critical. And the margin for miscalculation becomes thinner. In Asia, the observation is careful and deliberate. This is not just a distant conflict. It is a case study, a demonstration of how power is projected, how alliances respond, how systems behave under pressure. The lessons drawn here will not remain confined to this region. They will influence decisions in entirely different contexts, shaping strategies that may not become visible until much later. And beneath all of this, there is a deeper shift taking place. The concept of deterrence itself is evolving. Traditionally, deterrence relied on clarity, clear capabilities, clear consequences, clear communication. But in a situation like this, clarity is harder to maintain. When capabilities are rapidly introduced, when intentions are ambiguous, when signals can be misread, deterrence becomes less stable. It requires not just strength, but interpretation. And interpretation, especially under stress, is inherently uncertain. This uncertainty feeds into the decision-making process. Leaders are not operating with perfect information. They are working with fragments. Intelligence that is accurate but incomplete. Signals that are meaningful but open to multiple interpretations. And time that is always shorter than it appears. Under these conditions, the risk is not just that a wrong decision is made, it is that a decision made with reasonable logic leads to unintended consequences. There is also the human factor. It is easy to think of this as a purely strategic or technological problem, missiles, defense systems, military assets, but at the center of it are individuals, decision makers who carry the weight of outcomes that extend far beyond their immediate environment. They are not abstract actors. They are people working under pressure, fatigue, and uncertainty. And history shows that in such conditions, even well-designed systems can produce unexpected results. As the hours pass, the situation does not simplify. It becomes more complex. More variables enter the equation. More actors adjust their positions. More data flows in, sometimes clarifying, sometimes complicating. The sense of anticipation grows, not because something has happened, but because something could happen at any moment. And this is where the final layer of the situation reveals itself. The most significant impact of these developments may not be the immediate outcome, but the long-term change they introduce. Regardless of whether this crisis escalates into open conflict or is somehow contained, the underlying assumptions have already been altered. The scale of the transfer, the speed at which it occurred, the limitations of detection and prevention, these are now part of the strategic landscape. Future planning will incorporate this moment. Defense systems will be reevaluated. Intelligence priorities will shift. Alliances may strengthen or strain depending on how events unfold. And nations that were previously on the margins of these considerations may move closer to the center, driven by the recognition that the barriers to acquiring advanced capabilities are not as absolute as once believed. So when you return to that moment at 3:47 a.m., when the phones lit up and the alert was issued, it is no longer just a single event. It is the visible edge of a much larger process, a process that is still unfolding, still being shaped by decisions that have not yet been made. There is a tendency to look for resolution, for a clear ending that restores stability and closes the narrative. But situations like this rarely provide that kind of closure. They transition. They evolve into new forms. The immediate tension may pass, but the structural changes remain. They influence what comes next, often in ways that are not immediately visible. For now, the world remains in that space between action and outcome, watching, calculating, waiting. Not passively, but actively, each actor adjusting, preparing, positioning for what might come. The uncertainty is not a gap in understanding. It is the defining feature of the moment. And that is where this stands. Not at a conclusion, but at a threshold. A point where multiple paths remain possible, each carrying its own consequences, each dependent on decisions that are being made in real time. The next move has not been revealed, but it is coming. And when it does, it will not exist in isolation. It will connect to everything that has been set in motion, shaping not just the immediate future, but the structure of what follows.